In the untamed wilderness of Colorado Territory, 1882, a woman's dreams of domestic bliss are shattered when she arrives to find not a thriving frontier town, but a devastated wasteland left in the wake of nature's fury, with nothing but her wits, a leather satchel of personal belongings, and an iron will forged in the factories of Boston. Margaret Maggie Sullivan must decide whether to flee back east or take command of a broken community while waiting for the only man who might know where her intended husband has gone. This is the story of a woman who traveled 2,000 miles to start a new life, only to discover that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when everything goes wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to an abrupt halt, throwing Margaret Sullivan against the wooden side with enough force to rattle her teeth. Through the small window, she glimpsed muddy water rushing past, where a road should have been, carrying with it the debris of what had once been a prosperous settlement. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice strained with exhaustion. "Can't go no further. Bridge is out and the whole valley's been turned upside down." Margaret gathered her dark wool traveling dress around her and accepted the driver's weathered hand as she stepped down onto what remained of the main street of Clearwater Falls, Colorado Territory. The name, she realized with bitter irony, had proven prophetic in the worst possible way. What should have been a bustling frontier town was now a landscape of devastation. Buildings stood at odd angles, their foundations undermined by the floodwaters that had clearly raged through only days before. Mud caked everything in sight, and the acrid smell of standing water mixed with the earthy scent of displaced soil filled her nostrils. Where the town square should have been, a massive pile of debris created an artificial hill of broken timber, overturned wagons, and household goods. "Sweet Mother of God," Margaret whispered, her Boston Irish accent thickening with shock. She had expected to step into the arms of Thomas Brennan, the gentle rancher whose letters had won her heart over 6 months of correspondence. Instead, she found herself ankle-deep in mud, staring at what appeared to be the remains of civilization. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Pete Hawthorne, was already unloading her trunk and carpet bag from the roof of the coach. "Sorry, miss, but I got to turn around and head back to Denver before dark. These mountain roads ain't safe after what happened here." "What did happen here?" Margaret asked, lifting her skirts to navigate around a overturned water trough. "Mr. Brennan wrote that Clearwater Falls was a thriving community with over 300 residents." Hawthorne paused in his work, his expression growing somber. "Was, miss. That's the key word. 3 nights ago, the dam up in Bear Creek Canyon gave way. All that snowmelt from the unusually warm spring, plus the heavy rains we've been having, it was just too much. The whole thing came down like the hand of God himself." Margaret felt her heart sink into her stomach. "And the people, the residents, most got out alive, thanks to Samuel Ridge," Hawthorne continued, hefting her trunk to the ground with a grunt. "He's the territory's best tracker and guide. Man knows these mountains like the back of his hand. Soon as he saw the signs that the dam was weakening, he rode through town in the middle of the night, banging on doors, getting folks to higher ground." "Samuel Ridge," Margaret repeated, filing the name away. "Where is he now?" Hawthorne's expression darkened further. "That's the thing, miss. After he got everyone evacuated, he went back to look for stragglers. Found your intended, Thomas Brennan, trying to save his livestock. Both of them got caught in a secondary flood when another section of the dam broke loose." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Thomas? Is he—" "Don't rightly know, miss. Ridge and Brennan both got swept downstream. Ridge's horse came back riderless 2 days ago, but no sign of either man. Could be they made it to safety somewhere downriver. Could be—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood the implication. She stood in the muddy street, her carefully planned future crumbling around her like the buildings of Clearwater Falls. At 26 years old, she had saved every penny from her job at the textile mill in Boston to make this journey. Her few remaining relatives had thought her mad for answering a rancher's advertisement for a bride, but Thomas's letters had painted such a vivid picture of life in the Colorado mountains that she had fallen in love with both the man and the dream he offered. Now, surrounded by devastation, with her intended missing and possibly dead, Margaret faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could return to Boston with Pete Hawthorne, resume her position at the mill, and live out her days in the grey industrial landscape she had been so eager to escape. Or she could stay and face whatever challenges this broken town might offer. Movement near what had been the general store caught her attention. A woman emerged from the tilted building, her dress torn and muddy, carrying a crying infant. Behind her came two small children, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. The woman's eyes met Margaret's across the debris-strewn street, and in that gaze, Margaret saw a desperation that cut straight to her soul. "Ma'am!" the woman called out, stumbling through the mud toward them. "Are you the teacher, the one who was supposed to come on the Thursday stage?" Margaret shook her head. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. I came to marry Thomas Brennan." The woman's face fell. "Oh, we'd heard tell that the territorial government was sending a teacher to help us rebuild. I'm Sarah Coleman. This is my baby Emma and my children, Billy and Mary." She gestured to the muddy youngsters clinging to her skirts. "Where are your husbands?" Margaret asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "My husband John went with a group of men to try to recover what they could from the downstream settlements. That was 3 days ago. We haven't heard anything since." Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion and worry. "Most of the other men went, too. We've got maybe a dozen people left in town, mostly women and children, and a few older folks who couldn't make the journey." Pete Hawthorne cleared his throat impatiently. "Miss Sullivan, I really do need to be heading back. You coming with me or not?" Margaret looked at Sarah Coleman's desperate face, at the children who had clearly been crying for days, at the destroyed town that had once held such promise. Then she looked at her trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, and the carpet bag that held Thomas's letters, the letters that had brought her here to find love and a new life. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "I'll be staying." The stagecoach driver's eyebrows shot up. "Miss, with respect, you don't understand what you're saying. There's no hotel, no boarding house, hardly any shelter at all. And with the men gone, it ain't safe for a lady alone." "I won't be alone," Margaret replied, moving to stand beside Sarah Coleman. "I'll be with the other residents of Clearwater Falls. Mrs. Coleman, do you have somewhere I could stay just temporarily?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief. "The church still has most of its roof. We've been sleeping there, all of us together. You'd be more than welcome." Margaret nodded decisively. "Then it's settled." She turned back to Pete Hawthorne. "Please, and tell anyone who asks in Denver that Margaret Sullivan is in Clearwater Falls, and that when Thomas Brennan returns, or when Samuel Ridge returns with news of him, they'll find me here." Hawthorne shook his head, but began climbing back onto his driver's seat. "You're either the bravest woman I ever met or the most foolish. I hope for your sake it's the former." With a crack of his whip, the stagecoach lurched into motion, turning in a wide circle before heading back up the mountain road. Margaret watched until it disappeared around a bend, then picked up her carpet bag and looked at her trunk. "Mrs. Coleman, do you know if there are any able-bodied men still in town who could help move this to the church?" "There's old Ben Fitzgerald, but his back's been giving him trouble, and young Jimmy Torres, but he's only 14. Sarah shifted the baby to her other hip. Most everything's been done by hand since the flood. We lost most of our livestock too. Then we'll manage, Margaret said firmly. She examined her trunk, gauging its weight and bulk. Mrs. Coleman, Sarah, before we worry about my belongings, tell me about the town situation. What supplies do you have? What are the most pressing needs? Sarah looked surprised by the directness of the question, but answered readily. The well behind the church is still good. Sam Ridge showed us how to test it before he left. We've got some food from what we could salvage, but it won't last more than a few days. The biggest problem is shelter. The church roof leaks when it rains, and with winter still possible this high up in the mountains, we need better protection. Margaret nodded, her mind already working. During her years at the textile mill, she had served as a floor supervisor, responsible for organizing work crews and managing resources under pressure. The skills that had helped her manage 60 seamstresses, working against impossible deadlines, might prove useful in this very different crisis. What about tools, lumber, materials for repairs? Some tools survived in Garrison's workshop. That's the blacksmith shop there. Sarah pointed to a building that looked relatively intact, though its forge was clearly flooded. As for lumber, there's plenty scattered around, but it's all mixed up with mud and debris. Would take considerable work to sort through it and see what's still usable. Margaret surveyed the town with fresh eyes, not seeing the destruction, but the possibilities. The buildings might be damaged, but most were still standing. The infrastructure was disrupted, but not destroyed. What the community lacked was not resources, but organization, leadership, and hope. Sarah, I want you to gather everyone tonight at the church. Every person still in Clearwater Falls. We're going to make some plans. Plans? Sarah's voice was hesitant. Ma'am, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we're just trying to survive until the men get back. Surviving isn't enough, Margaret said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Thomas Brennan chose this town for a reason. He wrote to me about its potential, its promise. I don't know when he'll return, or when Samuel Ridge will return with news, but I do know that we can't just wait for rescue. We have to rescue ourselves. As if summoned by her words, the sound of a horse's hooves echoed through the valley. Both women turned hopefully toward the road, but instead of a returning husband or the tracker they all hoped for, a lone rider approached, a weathered man in a territorial marshal's badge. Mrs. Coleman, he called out as he drew near. I'm Marshal David Hayes from the territorial capital. I came as soon as word reached us about the flood. How many survivors do you have here? Sarah looked at Margaret, then back at the marshal. 13, sir, counting the children. 14 now, she added, nodding toward Margaret. Marshal Hayes dismounted, his expression grim. I'm afraid I have news about the men who went downstream. We found their camp about 30 miles south of... Here, signs of another flood, recent. No survivors that we could find, but also no bodies. Could be they made it to safety further downstream. Could be the water carried them off. Margaret felt Sarah sag beside her, the weight of this news almost too much to bear. But instead of despair, Margaret felt something else rising within her. A fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. Marshal Hayes, she said, stepping forward, what resources can the territorial government provide for the survivors here? The marshal looked surprised to be addressed so directly by a woman he didn't recognize. And you are? Margaret Sullivan. I arrived today to marry Thomas Brennan, only to find this situation. Mrs. Coleman and the others have been struggling alone for 3 days. They need immediate assistance. Hayes removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. Miss Sullivan, I'll be honest with you. The territorial government is stretched thin. There are 3 other communities that were hit by flooding in the past month. Our resources are limited, and Clearwater Falls. He gestured at the devastation around them. Most officials think it would be better to relocate the survivors to established towns rather than try to rebuild here. Relocate? Sarah's voice was sharp with indignation. "This is our home. Our lives are here." "Ma'am, I understand your feelings," Hayes said gently, "but rebuilding would require significant resources, expertise, and leadership that we can provide ourselves," Margaret interrupted. "Marshall, give us 2 weeks, 2 weeks to show that this community can rebuild and thrive. If we can't demonstrate real progress in that time, then we'll consider relocation." Hayes stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "Miss Sullivan, with respect, you just arrived. You don't understand the scope of what you're suggesting. I understand that 13 people have survived a disaster that could have killed them all," Margaret replied firmly. "I understand that they've managed to stay alive and help each other for 3 days without outside assistance. And I understand that sometimes the most important thing a community needs is someone willing to believe in its future." Sarah Coleman straightened beside her, the baby still in her arms, but her voice growing stronger. "Marshall Hayes, if Miss Sullivan thinks we can do this, then I say we try. I'd rather die trying to rebuild my home than live as a refugee in someone else's town." Hayes looked between the two women, then at the devastation around them, then back at Margaret's determined face. "2 weeks," he said finally. "I'll put in my report that the survivors of Clearwater Falls are attempting to rebuild under temporary leadership. But if you can't show substantial progress, the territorial government will mandate relocation for your own safety." "We'll show progress," Margaret said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "When Samuel Ridge returns, he'll find a town worth coming back to." As Marshall Hayes mounted his horse and rode away toward Denver, Margaret stood in the muddy street of Clearwater Falls and felt the weight of 13 lives settling on her shoulders. She had come here to be a wife, to build a quiet domestic life with a man she had never met but had learned to love through his letters. Instead, she found herself about to become something she had never imagined, the leader of a frontier community, fighting for its very survival. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the debris-filled valley. In a few hours, she would address the surviving residents of Clearwater Falls and ask them to trust her with their futures. She had no idea if she was capable of the task she had set for herself, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not let this community die on her watch. Thomas Brennan had written to her about the strength and spirit of the people who chose to build their lives in the wilderness. Tomorrow, she would find out if that strength was real and if it was enough to rebuild a town from the ashes of disaster. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of the Clearwater Falls Church was a study in makeshift survival. Blankets hung from rope lines to create private spaces for families, while cooking pots and salvaged belongings were organized in careful piles along the walls. The smell of wood smoke from a small fire built in what had once been the vestry, mixed with the lingering dampness of flood damage. Margaret stood before the assembled survivors, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. 13 faces looked up at her with expressions ranging from desperate hope to skeptical wariness. In the flickering candlelight, she could see the toll the past 3 days had taken on each of them. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to project over the noise of textile machinery. "I know you don't know me, and I know you have every reason to doubt that an outsider can understand your situation. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving, so let's talk about what we're going to do." An elderly man with a white beard raised his hand. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Ben Fitzgerald. Been living in Clearwater Falls for 8 years, since before there was much. More than a trading post here. With respect, Mom, you seem like a fine lady, but organizing folks and rebuilding a town are 2 different things entirely." Margaret nodded, acknowledging his concern. You're absolutely right, Mr. Fitzgerald. I've never built a town, but I have managed 60 workers under impossible deadlines in a Boston textile mill. I've organized supply chains, managed resources, and kept people working together when everything seemed hopeless. The skills aren't identical, but they're not entirely different either. A woman in her 40s, her graying hair pulled back severely, spoke up. I'm Helen Morrison. My husband ran the general store before. She gestured vaguely toward the window, where the tilted remains of the building were visible in the moonlight. What exactly are you proposing we do? We don't have supplies, we don't have proper tools, and winter could come early this high. Up. Margaret had spent the hours since Marshal Hayes left walking through the town, taking mental inventory, and developing what she hoped was a realistic assessment of their situation. Mrs. Morrison, let me tell you what I see. I see a community with a functioning well, which means we won't die of thirst. I see enough salvageable lumber scattered around to repair at least half the buildings, which means we won't freeze. And I see 13 people who survived a disaster that could have killed them all, which means we have the most important resource of any community, determination. Young Jimmy Torres, the 14-year-old Sarah had mentioned, leaned forward eagerly. What's the plan, Miss Sullivan? What do we do first? Margaret smiled at his enthusiasm. We organize. Tomorrow morning, we divide into 3 teams. Team 1, led by Mrs. Coleman, will focus on immediate survival needs. Food inventory, cooking arrangements, and basic sanitation. Team 2, led by Mr. Fitzgerald, will assess building damage and begin sorting salvageable materials. Team 3, led by Mrs. Morrison, will establish a basic workshop where we can repair tools and equipment. And what will you be doing while we're doing all the work? The question came from a man Margaret hadn't been introduced to, his tone carrying a clear challenge. I'll be doing what every good supervisor does, Margaret replied evenly. Making sure each team has what it needs, solving problems as they arise and planning the next phase of work. I'll also be keeping detailed records of our progress for Marshal Hayes's return. Ben Fitzgerald stroked his beard thoughtfully. Miss Sullivan, even if we can get some basic repairs done, we're still talking about rebuilding an entire community. The sawmill is gone, the bank is flooded, the school is... He shook his head. How do we replace all that? Margaret had been hoping someone would ask this question. We don't try to replace it all at once, Mr. Fitzgerald. We prioritize. What does Clearwater Falls need to function as a basic community? Shelter, obviously, a general store or trading post for supplies. Eventually, a school for the children. But we build back gradually, focusing on what's essential first. Helen Morrison frowned. And how do we pay for supplies? Most of us lost everything in the flood. The bank's records are destroyed, so even if people had money deposited, there's no way to prove it. This was the question Margaret had been dreading, because she didn't have a complete answer. Mrs. Morrison, we'll have to be creative. We have skills and labor to trade. We have some salvageable goods and... She hesitated, then decided on honesty. I have some savings from my years at the mill. Not enough to rebuild a town, but enough to get us started. A murmur ran through the assembled group. Sarah Coleman spoke first. Miss Sullivan, we can't ask you to spend your own money on our town. You're not asking, Margaret replied firmly. I'm offering. I came here to build a life, and this is where that life begins. Whether Thomas returns tomorrow or in 6 months, Clearwater Falls is my home now. The man who had challenged her earlier stood up. I'm Frank Walsh. I ran the livery stable before the flood took it and most of my horses with it. His expression had softened somewhat. Miss Sullivan, I apologize for my tone earlier. It's just, we've been disappointed before. Territorial promises that never materialized. Investors who took our money and vanished. You can understand why we might be skeptical of grand plans. Margaret nodded. I can, Mr. Walsh. That's why I'm not making grand plans. I'm making practical ones. Tomorrow we start with small, achievable goals. We repair the church roof properly. We set up a functional kitchen. We begin sorting through the debris for usable materials. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible, just steady progress. An older woman Margaret hadn't met spoke up. I'm Martha Pierce. I was the town's seamstress. She looked around at the assembled group. Miss Sullivan, what you're describing sounds reasonable, but there's something we haven't discussed. What happens if our men don't come back? What happens if Samuel Ridge doesn't return with good news about Thomas Brennan? The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Margaret had been asking herself the same thing since Pete Hawthorne's stagecoach had disappeared around the mountain bend. Mrs. Pierce, she said slowly, I don't know. I hope Thomas is alive, and I hope he'll return. I believe Samuel Ridge is the kind of man who keeps his word, and he'll come back with news one way or another. But if they don't, she paused, looking around at each face in the candlelight. If they don't, then we build something here that's worth having even without them. We create a community that can survive and thrive regardless of who comes or goes. Jimmy Torres raised his hand again. Miss Sullivan, what if Marshal Hayes comes back in 2 weeks and says we haven't made enough progress? What if the territorial government tries to force us to leave? Margaret smiled grimly. Then we'll have to prove them wrong, won't we, Jimmy? But let me tell you something I learned in the mills. Bureaucrats are impressed by organization, documentation, and visible progress. If we can show Marshal Hayes detailed plans, work schedules, and measurable improvements, he'll have a hard time arguing that we're not capable of rebuilding. Ben Fitzgerald stood up, his joints creaking audibly. Miss Sullivan, I've heard enough. You're asking us to trust you with our futures based on one day's acquaintance. That's not a small thing. Margaret felt her heart sink, but Fitzgerald continued. However, it's not like we have an abundance of alternatives. If you're willing to put your own money and effort behind your words, then I'm willing to follow your lead. At least for 2 weeks. One by one, the other survivors voiced their agreement. Not enthusiastic endorsement, Margaret noted, but cautious willingness to try. It was enough to start with. All right then, she said, clapping her hands together. Let's talk specifics. Mrs. Coleman, what's our current food situation? Sarah shifted the sleeping baby in her arms. We have maybe 3 days of basics. Flour, beans, some preserved meat that we managed to save. The vegetable gardens were all washed away, of course. Mrs. Morrison, what about the general store? Anything salvageable? Helen Morrison shook her head. Some canned goods that weren't damaged, a few tools, odds and ends. Not much that's useful for rebuilding. Margaret nodded, making mental notes. Mr. Walsh, you mentioned losing most of your horses. How many do we have for transportation and heavy work? 2, Frank Walsh replied grimly. An old mare named Bessie and a gelding called Thunder. Both are good for riding or light hauling, but not much more. The inventory continued for another hour. By the time they finished, Margaret had a clear picture of their resources. Minimal, but not hopeless. More importantly, she had a sense of the people she would be working with. They were tired, grieving and uncertain, but they were also survivors who had already proven their resilience. One last thing, she said, as the meeting wound down. I want everyone to understand that I'm not trying to replace the leadership you had before. When your husbands and fathers return, when Samuel Ridge brings news, this community will make its own decisions about the future. I'm just trying to keep things together until that happens. Martha Pierce smiled for the first time that evening. Miss Sullivan, speaking for myself, I hope Thomas Brennan appreciates what kind of woman he's getting. Not many people would do what you're doing. As the survivors settled into their makeshift beds around the church, Margaret found herself sitting beside the small fire in the vestry, staring into the flames and wondering what she had gotten herself into. 24 hours ago, she'd been a passenger on a stagecoach, dreaming of a quiet domestic life with a rancher she had never met. Now she was responsible for the survival of 13 people and the rebuilding of an entire community. Sarah Coleman. He approached, having settled her children for the night. "Miss Sullivan, Margaret, I wanted to thank you for what you're doing, not just the organizing and planning, but for giving us hope again. These past 3 days we've just been trying to get through each hour. You've given us something to work toward." Margaret looked up at the young mother. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you really think we can do this? Rebuild the town, I mean." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think we have to try. My children need to grow up somewhere. They can be proud of, not in some charity shelter in a strange city. If there's a chance we can rebuild our home, then we have to take it." Outside, the mountain wind whistled through the gaps in the church walls, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and the promise of coming winter. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and added another piece of wood to the fire. Tomorrow would bring the real test of her leadership. It was one thing to make inspiring speeches in a candlelit church. It would be quite another to organize actual work crews and tackle the overwhelming task of rebuilding. But, for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Margaret felt a cautious optimism. These people had survived the worst disaster in their town's history. With organization, determination, and a little luck, maybe they could survive her leadership too. As she finally settled down on her own blanket near the fire, Margaret's last thought before sleep was of Thomas Brennan and Samuel Ridge, somewhere out there in the Colorado wilderness. Whether they were alive or dead, safe or in danger, she had made a promise to keep their community alive until answers came. Tomorrow, she would find out if she was capable of keeping that promise. Dawn broke grey and cold over Clearwater Falls, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks like tattered shrouds. Margaret woke to the sound of rain pattering against the church windows and the distant rumble of thunder echoing through the valley. As she sat up on her makeshift bed, water dripped steadily through a gap in the roof she hadn't noticed the night before, landing with hollow plops in a tin basin someone had strategically placed. "Morning, Margaret," Sarah Coleman whispered, trying not to wake the children still sleeping nearby. "I've been up since before dawn. The rain started about an hour ago." Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and moved carefully between the sleeping forms scattered across the church floor. Through the cracked window, she could see that what had been muddy streets yesterday were now small rivers carrying fresh debris downstream. Her heart sank as she realized their first day of organized work would have to begin with bailing water instead of sorting lumber. "How bad is the flooding inside the other buildings?" she asked, joining Sarah near the small cooking fire. "Frank Walsh checked the stable before the rain got heavy," Sarah replied, stirring a pot of what smelled like thin porridge. "He said water was already ankle-deep in the workshop, and that was an hour ago." Margaret nodded grimly, adjusting her mental plans for the day. In the textile mill, she had learned that successful supervision meant adapting quickly when circumstances changed. "We'll work with what we have. Indoor tasks today, inventory, planning, repairs that can be done under cover." As the other survivors began to wake, Margaret noticed something that hadn't been apparent in the previous evening's candlelight. Several of the adults showed signs of illness, persistent coughs, pale complexions, and the glazed look of low-grade fever. The combination of stress, inadequate shelter, and exposure to contaminated floodwater was taking its toll. "Mrs. Pierce," she called softly to the seamstress, "how are you feeling this morning?" Martha Pierce attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Been better, dear. This cough started yesterday and I can't seem to shake the chills." Margaret's concern deepened as she looked around and identified at least 4 other adults showing similar symptoms. If illness spread through their small group, Their already limited workforce would be decimated. Sarah, we need to add medical supplies to our immediate priority list, she said quietly. Do you know if there's anything usable left in Dr. Henderson's office? Dr. Henderson went with the men downstream, Sarah replied. But his office wasn't completely destroyed. Might be some medicines left, though most everything got waterlogged. By mid-morning, despite the steady rain, Margaret had the 3 work teams assembled in different areas of the church. Mrs. Coleman's group was conducting a thorough inventory of their food supplies and establishing a cooking rotation that would stretch their resources as far as possible. The results were sobering. They had perhaps 5 days of basic sustenance if they rationed carefully. Mr. Fitzgerald's team was examining the structural damage to the church itself, identifying the most critical repairs needed to keep their shelter functional through the coming weeks. The leaking roof was just the beginning. Several support beams showed signs of water damage, and the foundation had shifted enough to create gaps in the walls. Mrs. Morrison's workshop team had the most challenging task, sorting through the water-damaged contents of various buildings to identify salvageable tools and supplies. What they were finding painted a stark picture of the community's losses. Miss Sullivan, Helen Morrison reported, her voice tight with frustration, we've been through the blacksmith shop, the general store, and what's left of the bank. Most of the metal tools are rusty but salvageable with work. But the flour, sugar, cloth goods, paper records, all ruined, and the banking document, she shook her head. Even if people had money deposited, there's no way to prove how much or who owned what. Margaret absorbed this information while helping Jimmy Torres organize a pile of water-stained books they'd rescued from the school. The boy's enthusiasm hadn't dimmed despite the grim circumstances, and his energy was proving invaluable for morale. Mrs. Morrison, what about medical supplies? Were you able to check Dr. Henderson's office? Some things survived, Helen replied. Basic bandaging materials, a few bottles of medicine that were sealed well enough to stay dry, but nothing for serious illness or injury. As if summoned by their conversation, Frank Walsh appeared in the church doorway, soaked to the skin and breathing heavily. Miss Sullivan, we've got a problem. The rain's undermining what's left of the dam upstream. If it gives way completely, we could see another flood, maybe worse than the first one. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. How much time do we have? Hard to say, Walsh replied, wringing water from his hat. Could be hours, could be days, but we need to be ready to evacuate to higher ground if necessary. The words sent a chill through the assembled survivors that had nothing to do with the cold rain. Margaret could see the fear in their faces, the prospect of losing. What little they had managed to salvage was almost too much to bear. All right, she said, forcing her voice to remain calm and authoritative. We plan for both possibilities. Mr. Walsh, can you and Jimmy identify the safest high ground within a reasonable distance? Mrs. Coleman, we need to prepare emergency packs with essentials for each family. Mr. Fitzgerald, what are our options for temporarily reinforcing the church if we get advance warning of another flood? As the teams scattered to address these new priorities, Margaret found herself alone for the first time since her arrival. The magnitude of the challenges they faced seemed to grow by the hour. Illness, limited supplies, structural damage, and now the threat of additional flooding. She had promised Marshal Hayes 2 weeks of progress, but she was beginning to wonder if they would survive 2 more days. A soft knock on the church door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find a stranger, a man in his 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Miss Sullivan, he asked, removing his hat despite the rain. I'm Dr. Michael Crawford from Denver. I heard about the situation here and thought you might need medical assistance. Margaret stared at him in amazement. Dr. Crawford, you're an answer to prayer. How did you know to come? Marshal Hayes stopped by my practice on his way back to the capital. Crawford explained, shouldering a large medical bag. He mentioned you had survivors in need of care. I specialize in frontier medicine, treating communities that don't have regular medical services. Margaret quickly ushered him inside, her mind racing with relief and new possibilities. Doctor, we have several people showing signs of illness, probably from exposure and contaminated water. And we're facing the possibility of another flood if the remaining dam structure fails. Crawford nodded professionally, already scanning the assembled survivors with a practiced eye. Typical post-disaster health issues. I brought supplies for water purification, basic antibiotics, and emergency medical care. I can stay for about a week before I need to return to Denver. A week might be enough to get us stabilized, Margaret said gratefully. What do you need from us? Space to set up a proper examination area and assistance from someone with steady hands, Crawford replied. And Miss Sullivan? I also brought news from Denver. There's been some political interest in your situation. Margaret's heart skipped. What kind of political interest? The territorial governor is facing pressure from railroad interests about land development in this region, Crawford explained, lowering his voice. There's apparently significant mineral potential in these mountains, and some powerful people are very interested in acquiring land that might be abandoned due to the flood. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. You're saying there are people who want Clearwater Falls to fail, who might actually benefit if we're forced to relocate? Crawford nodded grimly. I can't prove anything, but Marshal Hayes mentioned that he'd received some unusual pressure to recommend immediate relocation rather than giving you time to rebuild. It's possible you're facing more obstacles than just natural disasters. Margaret sank onto a nearby bench, the weight of this revelation combining with all the other challenges they faced. Not only were they fighting flood damage, illness, and limited resources, but they might also be fighting against powerful interests who wanted them to fail. Miss Sullivan, Dr. Crawford said gently, I know this is a lot to absorb, but I also want you to know that there are people in Denver who are impressed by what you're attempting here. Some influential citizens who believe communities like this represent the true spirit of the territory. You're not entirely without allies. Margaret looked around the church at the survivors who had trusted her with their futures. Sarah Coleman was patiently teaching her children to help with inventory tasks. Ben Fitzgerald was explaining construction techniques to Jimmy Torres with the patience of a grandfather. Helen Morrison was carefully cleaning and organizing salvaged tools with methodical precision. These people had survived one disaster and were preparing to face another. They had welcomed a stranger and followed her leadership based on little more than her willingness to stay and fight alongside them. The idea that powerful men in distant offices might be working to destroy their efforts filled her with an anger she hadn't known she possessed. Dr. Crawford, she said, standing up with renewed determination, I want you to tell your influential friends in Denver something. Tell them that Clearwater Falls isn't going anywhere. Tell them that 13 people can accomplish a lot when they're properly organized and motivated, and tell them that sometimes the most dangerous enemy of corruption is someone who has nothing left to lose. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere upstream, a damaged dam held back thousands of gallons of potentially destructive water. But inside the church, Margaret Sullivan felt something she hadn't experienced since stepping off the stagecoach, genuine confidence in their ability to succeed. The challenges were mounting, but so were their resources and allies. Tomorrow would bring new tests of their resolve, but tonight they had a doctor to treat their sick, knowledge of potential enemies to guard against, and the beginning of a plan that might just save them all. As she helped Dr. Crawford set up his examination area, Margaret found herself thinking of Thomas Brennan and Samuel Ridge somewhere in the wilderness. When they returned, and she was increasingly determined to believe they would return, they would find a community that had not only survived, but had grown stronger through adversity. The real battle for Clearwater Falls was just beginning. Morning of their fourth day dawned clear and crisp, with no sign of the threatening rains that had plagued them the day before. Margaret stood outside the church, breathing in the mountain air and surveying the progress they had made under Dr. Crawford's medical guidance. The 6 survivors were responding well to treatment, and the immediate threat of the dam collapse had receded as the water levels dropped overnight. For the first time since her arrival, Margaret allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The 3 work teams had found their rhythm, and even with their limited resources, they were beginning to make visible improvements to their situation. The church roof had been patched, a functional outdoor kitchen had been established, and they had successfully sorted nearly a quarter of the salvageable materials from the debris. That optimism was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Not the single rider they had been hoping for, but a group of at least 6 men riding hard toward the town. "Miss Sullivan!" Frank Walsh called out from his position near the stable. "Riders coming in from the east. They're pushing their horses pretty hard." Margaret felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the implications. No one pushed horses that hard unless they were running from something, chasing something, or carrying urgent news. None of those options seemed likely to bring good fortune to Clearwater Falls. As the riders drew closer, Margaret could make out their leader, a well-dressed man in an expensive coat, flanked by what appeared to be hired guns rather than territorial officials. The group reined in near the church, and their leader dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm looking for the woman calling herself the temporary leader of this settlement," he announced, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education mixed with Western authority. "I'm Robert Dalton, representing the Colorado Mountain Development Company." Margaret stepped forward, instinctively straightening her shoulders. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. What business does your company have in Clearwater Falls?" Dalton smiled, but there was nothing warm in the expression. "Miss Sullivan, I'm here to make you and the other survivors a very generous offer. My company is prepared to purchase all remaining claims and property rights in Clearwater Falls at fair market value. More than fair, actually, considering the current condition of the settlement." "Mr. Dalton," Margaret replied carefully, "I'm not sure what authority you think I have to negotiate property sales. I'm simply helping coordinate relief efforts until the regular residents return." "Ah, but that's the issue, Miss Sullivan," Dalton said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "I have here a report from territorial surveyors indicating that this valley is unsuitable for permanent habitation due to recurring flood risks. The territorial government is prepared to condemn the entire area as a public safety hazard." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her voice steady. "That's very convenient timing, Mr. Dalton. The territorial government gave us 2 weeks to demonstrate our ability to rebuild. We've been here less than 4 days. Circumstances change, Miss Sullivan. New information has come to light." Dalton's tone suggested he was being patient with a slow child. "The geological survey completed yesterday shows that the entire dam structure upstream is fundamentally unsound. Another flood is not just possible, but inevitable." Dr. Crawford emerged from the church, followed by several of the survivors who had obviously been listening to the conversation. "Mr. Dalton," the doctor interrupted, "I'm Dr. Michael Crawford from Denver. Might I ask who conducted this geological survey? I wasn't aware that any territorial surveyors had been in this area recently." Dalton's confident expression flickered slightly. "The survey was conducted by private contractors working under territorial authority, Doctor. The details are technical and not really relevant to this discussion." "On the contrary," Dr. Crawford replied smoothly, As the current medical officer for this community, I'm very interested in any scientific assessment that might affect the health and safety of my patients. Could you provide the name of the surveying company and the date of their assessment? Margaret watched this exchange with growing understanding. Dr. Crawford was clearly suspicious of Dalton's claims, and his questions were making the development company representative uncomfortable. Furthermore, Dr. Crawford continued, I find it curious that a private development company would be so concerned about public safety that they would rush out here with purchase offers immediately after receiving a report of geological instability. One of Dalton's companions, a rough-looking man with a gun prominently displayed on his hip, stepped forward. Mr. Dalton, maybe we should just make our position clear to these folks. Sometimes people need help understanding what's in their best interests. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine at the barely veiled threat, but before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. I wouldn't recommend that approach, gentlemen. Everyone turned to see a lone rider approaching from the direction of the mountain trail. The newcomer was a lean man in buckskins, with long dark hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent his life outdoors. Most importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone, very comfortable with the rifle resting across his saddle. Samuel Ridge, Margaret whispered, recognizing him from the descriptions she had heard. The tracker rode directly into the center of the confrontation, positioning his horse between Margaret and Dalton's men. Miss Sullivan, I presume? I'm Samuel Ridge. I believe you've been expecting me. Margaret's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Mr. Ridge, yes, we've been hoping for your return. Do you have news about Thomas Brennan and the other men? Ridge's expression grew somber. I do, ma'am, but it might be better. Discussed privately. First, though, I'm curious about these gentlemen and their urgent business here. Dalton had regained his composure, but Margaret noticed that his men had positioned themselves more defensively since Ridge's arrival. Mr. Ridge, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. I'm Robert Dalton, Colorado Mountain Development Company. We're simply here to offer these good people a fair price for property that's no longer viable for habitation. Is that so? Ridge dismounted slowly, his movements casual but alert. And what makes you so certain the property isn't viable? Last I checked, Clearwater Falls had some of the richest soil and best water access in this part of the territory. Recent geological surveys indicate, Dalton began. Recent surveys, Ridge interrupted. Funny thing about that, I've been tracking through these mountains for the past week, and I haven't seen any survey teams. Of course, I did notice some interesting activity down at the old mining claims about 10 miles south of here. Lot of new equipment being moved in, lot of fresh survey stakes being planted. Margaret saw Dalton's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The tracker's words were painting a very different picture of the Colorado Mountain Development Company's interests in the area. Mr. Ridge, Dalton said, his voice taking on a harder edge, I don't know what you're implying, but my company's activities are entirely legitimate and properly authorized by the territorial government. Oh, I'm sure they are, Ridge replied, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just like I'm sure it's pure coincidence that you showed up here with purchase offers right after a convenient geological survey declared the area uninhabitable. Sarah Coleman had joined the growing crowd of survivors watching this confrontation. Mr. Ridge, she called out, please, we need to know about our husbands, about John and the others who went downstream. Ridge nodded to her with obvious respect. Mrs. Coleman, your husband and the other men are alive. They're about 30 miles downstream, helping another community that was hit by the same flood system. They sent me back to check on Clearwater Falls and to bring word that they'll be returning within the week. A collective sigh of relief went up from the assembled survivors, but Margaret noticed that Ridge's expression remained troubled. There was more to the story, and she suspected it wasn't all good news. However, Ridge continued, his voice carrying, clearly in the mountain air, They also sent me back with a warning. They've encountered evidence that the flood damage wasn't entirely natural. Someone had been weakening the dam structure for weeks before the spring snowmelt put pressure on it. Dalton went very still. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Ridge. I hope you have evidence to support such a claim. Evidence is being gathered, Ridge replied calmly. The territorial marshal is very interested in investigating how a dam that had been declared sound just 2 months ago could fail so catastrophically. Margaret felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Mr. Dalton, perhaps you could tell us exactly when your geological survey was conducted and whether your company had any prior interest in this area before the flood occurred? For the first time since his arrival, Dalton looked genuinely uncomfortable. Miss Sullivan, I don't appreciate the implication of your questions. My company operates with complete transparency and in full compliance with territorial law. Then, you won't mind providing documentation of your survey and your company's previous activities in this region, Dr. Crawford interjected smoothly. I'm sure Marshal Hayes would be very interested in reviewing such materials. One of Dalton's men leaned close to whisper something urgent in his ear. After a brief exchange, Dalton remounted his horse, his confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled anger. Miss Sullivan, you and the other residents of this area would be wise to consider our offer carefully. This region is going to see significant development in the coming months, with or without your cooperation. It would be unfortunate if you found yourselves displaced by circumstances beyond your control. Mr. Dalton, Ridge said, his hand resting casually near his rifle. That sounded very much like a threat. In my experience, honest businessmen don't need to make threats to conduct their affairs. Dalton's face flushed red. Mr. Ridge, you may have a reputation in these mountains, but my company has resources and connections that extend far beyond your ability to interfere. I strongly advise you not to involve yourself in matters that don't concern you. Funny thing about that, Ridge replied, settling more comfortably in his saddle. Miss Sullivan here has hired me to guide Thomas Brennan back to Clearwater Falls when I find him. That makes the welfare of this community very much my concern. Margaret stared at Ridge in surprise. She had done no such thing, but she recognized the strategic value of his claim. With Samuel Ridge's protection and expertise, Dalton would think twice about using intimidation tactics against the survivors. Furthermore, Ridge continued, I've already sent word to the territorial capital about suspicious activities in this area. I expect we'll be seeing more official investigators in the coming days. Dalton wheeled his horse around, signaling to his men. This conversation isn't over, Miss Sullivan. My company's offer will remain open for exactly 48 hours. After that, you may find that your options become considerably more limited. As the development company riders galloped away, Margaret turned to Samuel Ridge with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. Mr. Ridge, thank you for your intervention, but I should clarify that I haven't actually hired you for anything. Ridge smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Miss Sullivan, I've been tracking through these mountains for 8 years. I can read sign that most men would miss entirely, and the sign I'm reading tells me that Clearwater Falls is about to become a very dangerous place for anyone who doesn't have powerful friends watching their backs. He dismounted and extended his hand to her. Thomas Brennan wrote to me about you before the flood, Miss Sullivan. He asked me to look after his intended bride if anything ever happened to him. Far as I'm concerned, that makes you my responsibility, until he can claim it himself. Margaret shook his hand, feeling the calloused strength of someone who lived by skill and determination. Mr. Ridge, I accept your offer gratefully, but I should warn you, I intend to fight for this community, regardless of what threats Mr. Dalton and his associates might make. Ma'am, Ridge replied with obvious approval, I wouldn't expect anything less from the woman who crossed half a continent to marry a frontier rancher. Now, shall we discuss what we're really up against here? after Dalton and his men disappeared. Over the ridge, Samuel Ridge led Margaret and the core group of survivors into the church for a private discussion. The trackers' presence had transformed the dynamic of their situation entirely. Where before they had been vulnerable refugees hoping to rebuild, they now had an experienced guide who understood the larger forces working against them. "First, things first," Ridge said, settling onto a wooden crate that served as seating. "Thomas Brennan is alive, but he's in no condition to travel yet. He took a bad knock to the head when the flood swept him downstream, and he's been unconscious for most of the past week. The men who went looking for survivors found him lodged against a fallen tree about 40 miles south of here." Margaret felt her knees weaken with relief. She had prepared herself for the worst news, and learning that Thomas was alive felt like a reprieve from a death sentence. "When will he be able to return?" she asked, trying to keep the emotion out of her voice. "Doc down there thinks maybe another week, possibly 2, Ridge replied. "Head injuries are tricky things. He's awake now and asking for you specifically. But he gets confused easily and tires quickly. The important thing is that he's recovering." Sarah Coleman leaned forward eagerly. "What about John, my husband?" "John Coleman is leading the rescue efforts in Creek Bend, the settlement that got hit after ours," Ridge explained. "That man's got natural leadership skills, Mrs. Coleman. He's organized 3 communities worth of survivors and has them working together like they've been neighbors for years." Relief and pride warred across Sarah's face. "That sounds like John. He always said a community was only as strong as its willingness to help its neighbors. Which brings me to the less pleasant news," Ridge continued, his expression growing serious. "The flood wasn't entirely an act of God. Someone had been systematically weakening the dam structure for weeks before the spring snowmelt put critical pressure on it." Dr. Crawford had been listening intently. "Do you have evidence of this sabotage?" Ridge nodded grimly. "I found drill holes that had been filled with black powder and detonated in a pattern designed to create structural weakness. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted the dam to fail, but not immediately. They wanted it to collapse under natural pressure so it would look like an accident." Margaret felt a cold fury building in her chest. "Someone deliberately caused the flood that killed families and destroyed our community." "More than that," Ridge said. "The same explosive residue I found at our dam was present at the Creek Bend dam site. This wasn't an isolated incident. Someone systematically targeted multiple communities along the river system." Frank Walsh, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Ridge, I need to tell you something. About 2 months ago, I had strangers asking questions about our dam. They claimed to be territorial inspectors, but something felt off about them." Ridge's attention focused sharply on the livery stable owner. "What kind of questions?" "Technical things mostly. How often was it inspected? Who had access to the maintenance areas? What would happen to downstream communities if it failed?" Walsh replied. "At the time, I figured they were just being thorough. But now, it sounds like reconnaissance," Ridge finished. "Mr. Walsh, can you describe these men?" "One of them was well-dressed, spoke like he had education. The other was rougher, kept asking about mining claims and mineral rights in the area." Walsh paused, his face growing troubled. "Come to think of it, the educated one looked a lot like that Dalton fellow who was here this morning." Margaret exchanged glances with Dr. Crawford. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with terrifying clarity. "There's more," Ridge continued. "I spent some time scouting the mining operations south of here before coming to town. The Colorado Mountain Development Company has been moving heavy equipment into the area for months. They've got excavation work going on that would require massive amounts of water, more water than the natural flow of the river could provide. Unless the dams were removed and all that stored water was released at once," Dr. Crawford said, understanding dawning in his voice. "Exactly. They created their own flood to clear out the communities, then swooped in with purchase offers for the flood-damaged land at bargain prices, Ridge explained. It's a land grab disguised as a natural disaster. Helen Morrison had been listening, with growing anger. Those monsters killed innocent people for mining claims? Worse than that, Ridge said. According to the territorial records I was able to check, this entire valley sits on what geologists believe is one of the richest silver veins in Colorado Territory. We're not just talking about mining claims. We're talking about millions of dollars in mineral wealth. Margaret stood up, pacing to the window and back as she processed this information. Everything about their situation had changed in the span of an hour. They weren't just rebuilding from a natural disaster. They were fighting against deliberate sabotage by people with enormous financial motivation to see them fail. "Mr. Ridge," she said finally, "what are our options?" Dalton made it clear that his company has resources and political connections. How do we fight something like that? Ridge smiled for the first time since beginning his explanation. "Miss Sullivan, you've already done the hardest part. You've kept this community together and functioning for nearly a week. You've documented your progress and shown that Clearwater Falls can be rebuilt. That gives us legal and moral standing to fight back." "But fighting back against what?" Ben Fitzgerald asked. "If they have political connections, they could probably get the territorial government to condemn this area regardless of what we accomplish." "That's where things get interesting," Dr. Crawford interjected. "I mentioned earlier that you have allies in Denver. Some of those allies happen to be very interested in preventing exactly this kind of corruption. There are powerful people who believe the territory's future depends on honest development, not land grabs disguised as disasters." Ridge nodded approvingly. "Doc's right. I've been in contact with territorial investigators who specialize in mining fraud. They've been watching the Colorado Mountain Development Company for months, looking for evidence of illegal activities." Margaret felt a spark of hope igniting. "Are you saying we could expose this conspiracy?" "I'm saying we're going to expose it," Ridge replied with conviction. "But it's going to be dangerous. Dalton and his associates have already committed multiple felonies, including murder through sabotage. They're not going to surrender quietly when they realize their plan is falling apart." "What do you need from us?" Margaret asked. Ridge pulled a detailed map from his saddlebags and spread it on the improvised table. "First, we need to document everything. The dam damage, the explosive residue, the timeline of when the suspicious inspectors visited. Second, we need to make this community too visible to attack quietly. If Dalton tries to intimidate you, again, there need to be witnesses and consequences." "How do we accomplish that?" Sarah asked. "We invite every territorial official, newspaper reporter, and honest businessman we can contact to come see what you've accomplished here," Dr. Crawford suggested. "We turn Clearwater Falls into a symbol of frontier determination instead of a forgotten disaster." Ridge nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly, and we accelerate your rebuilding efforts. I brought supplies and equipment from the downstream communities, tools, lumber, food, and most importantly, skilled workers who want to help." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You brought help?" 12 good men who lost their own homes in the floods but want to see justice done," Ridge confirmed. "They're camped about 2 miles out, waiting for my signal. Most of them have construction skills, and all of them are motivated to stop the people who destroyed their communities." For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Margaret felt genuinely optimistic about their chances. They had gone from being 13 isolated survivors to being part of a larger movement for justice. "There's one more thing," Ridge said, his expression growing serious again. "Dalton gave you 48 hours before his offer expires. I suspect that deadline isn't arbitrary. He's probably planning something to force your hand, another accident or emergency that would justify immediate evacuation." Margaret felt her determination hardening into something like steel. "Then we need to be ready for him. Mr. Ridge, how quickly can we get your additional workers here and integrated into our rebuilding efforts?" "They can be here by tonight," Ridge replied. "But Miss Sullivan, you need to understand what you're committing to. Once we bring in outside help and start actively investigating the sabotage, there's no going back. Dalton and his company will see you as a direct threat to their operation." Margaret looked around the church at the faces of the people who had trusted her with their futures. Sarah Coleman, holding her baby, determination replacing the fear that had marked her features. For days, Ben Fitzgerald and Frank Walsh nodding their agreement despite the risks, Jimmy Torres practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of real action against their enemies. "Mr. Ridge," she said firmly, "I came to Colorado Territory to build a new life. I didn't expect that life to include fighting corruption and exposing murder, but I've learned that sometimes you don't get to choose your battles. They choose you." She moved to the center of the group, her voice carrying the authority she had developed over the past week. "We're going to rebuild Clearwater Falls. We're going to expose the people who tried to destroy us. And we're going to make sure this never happens to another community. If that makes us targets, then so be it." Ridge stood and extended his hand to her. "Miss Sullivan, I think Thomas Brennan is going to be very proud of the woman he's getting as a wife. Now, let's go save a town and catch some murderers." As the group began making detailed plans for the next phase of their fight, Margaret felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. She had come to Clearwater Falls expecting to become a rancher's wife. Instead, she was becoming something she had never imagined, a leader in the fight for justice on the American frontier. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains again, but this time Margaret welcomed them. Let Dalton and his associates bring whatever new troubles. They were planning. Clearwater Falls was ready for them. By evening, Clearwater Falls had been transformed. Samuel Ridge's promised reinforcements had arrived as the sun set behind the mountain peaks. 12 weathered men with calloused hands and determined expressions, leading pack horses loaded with tools, lumber, and supplies. Margaret stood in the church doorway, watching the newcomers set up their camp with military precision, and marveled at how quickly their situation had changed. "Miss Sullivan," called out a tall man with graying temples who appeared to be the leader of the new arrivals. "I'm Nathan Cooper, foreman from Creek Bend. Samuel Ridge tells us you've been holding this place together with nothing but grit and determination." Margaret stepped forward to shake his hand, noting the respectful but assessing way he looked at her. These men had come to help, but they were clearly reserving judgment about whether a woman could truly lead the kind of operation they were planning. "Mr. Cooper, we're grateful for your assistance. Mr. Ridge mentioned that you have construction experience." 20 years, building everything from barns to railroad bridges, Cooper confirmed. "Most of these men have similar skills. We've also brought something else you'll need, proof that the Colorado Mountain Development Company has been active in our area for months before the floods." He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebags and handed it to Margaret. "Company. Surveyors were mapping mineral claims all through our valley last fall. They filed official paperwork claiming water rights that didn't legally exist, and they bribed local officials to approve permits that should never have been granted." Margaret opened the portfolio, finding detailed maps, legal documents, and even photographs of mining equipment being moved into areas that had supposedly been untouched wilderness. "This is extensive documentation, Mr. Cooper. How did you manage to gather all this?" "My brother works for the Territorial Land Office in the capital," Cooper explained. "When he heard about the suspicious flooding patterns, he started pulling records. What he found was a systematic pattern of fraud stretching back almost a year." Dr. Crawford joined them, examining the documents with professional interest. "This changes everything. With this evidence, we can prove criminal intent rather than just sabotage after the fact. Samuel Ridge approached, having finished organizing the new camp. Miss Sullivan, we need to talk about timing. I've been watching the trails, and there's been increased activity from Dalton's people. They're not just planning to wait out their 48-hour deadline. They're preparing for something more immediate. Margaret felt a familiar chill of apprehension. What kind of preparation? Surveillance, mostly. They've got men positioned on the ridges watching our movements. But they've also been asking questions in the nearest settlements about territorial law enforcement, who's responsible for this area, how long it takes to get messages to the capital, that sort of thing. Cooper frowned. Sounds like they're planning to create a situation that would require immediate territorial intervention. Or eliminate the need for intervention entirely, Ridge said grimly. Miss Sullivan, these men aren't just corrupt businessmen. Some of them have backgrounds that suggest they're comfortable with violence when legal methods fail. Margaret absorbed this information while watching the organized activity around their makeshift camp. In less than 6 hours, they had gone from being a vulnerable group of survivors to a small but well-equipped force. The question was whether it would be enough to counter whatever Dalton was planning. Mr. Ridge, what's our defensive situation? If they decide to attack directly, can we hold them off? For a while, Ridge replied honestly, but that's not really the fight we want. If this turns into open warfare, innocent people get hurt, and Dalton can claim he was defending his legal rights against armed squatters. Dr. Crawford looked up from the legal documents. What we need is to force this into the open legally before they can stage whatever incident they're planning. If we can get territorial authorities here to witness their activities, it becomes much harder for them to operate in secret. How do we do that? Sarah Coleman asked, joining the discussion with her baby asleep in her arms. Marshal Hayes isn't due back for more than a week. Ridge smiled with satisfaction. Already taken care of, Mrs. Coleman. I sent word to the territorial capital this morning through the telegraph station in Pine Ridge, explained the situation and requested immediate investigation of possible mining fraud and sabotage. Should have territorial marshals here within 2 days. Margaret felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by concern. Mr. Ridge, will 2 days be soon enough? If Dalton is planning something immediate? That's why we're accelerating our rebuilding efforts, Nathan Cooper interjected. By tomorrow night, we'll have made more visible progress than most communities accomplish in a month. When the marshals arrive, they'll see a thriving settlement that's clearly worth preserving. And if Dalton tries to interfere before then? Margaret asked. Ridge's expression grew hard. Then we'll be ready for him. But first, we need to get everyone organized for maximum efficiency. Miss Sullivan, I'm going to need you to coordinate between the different work teams. These men know construction, but they don't know this community or what your priorities are. For the next hour, Margaret found herself in the familiar role of supervisor, but on a scale she had never imagined. Instead of managing textile workers, she was coordinating the rebuilding of an entire town. Cooper's men were assigned to structural repairs on the most critical buildings. The original survivors focused on interior work and organizing supplies. Dr. Crawford established a communications center in the church, preparing reports and documentation for the arriving marshals. As the teams dispersed to begin their evening preparations, Jimmy Torres approached Margaret with obvious excitement. Miss Sullivan, Mr. Cooper says I can help with the carpentry work tomorrow. He's going to teach me how to use some of the specialized tools they brought. Margaret smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, but her mind was already racing ahead to the challenges of the next day. Jimmy, I want you to also help me with something else. We need to document everything we accomplish tomorrow. Take notes, help me keep track of materials used, work completed, that sort of thing. You mean like keeping records for the marshals? Jimmy asked, understanding immediately. Exactly. We need to be able to prove that this community is viable and that we're making genuine progress. As the last of the planning sessions concluded and people began settling into their sleeping arrangements, Margaret found herself alone with Samuel Ridge near the small fire they maintained in the church vestry. "Mr. Ridge," she said quietly, "can I ask you something personal? Why are you doing this? I mean, helping us fight Dalton and his company. You could have just delivered your message about Thomas and left." Ridge was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Miss Sullivan, I've been guiding people through these mountains for 8 years. I've seen what happens when honest folks get pushed around by people with money and political connections. Most of the time, there's not much one man can do about it." He looked up at her, his expression serious but not grim. "But this time it's different. This time there's someone willing to stand up and fight back. Someone who's turned a bunch of scattered survivors into a real community. Thomas Brennan wrote to me about you before the flood, said you were the kind of woman who could thrive on the frontier. He was right, but I don't think even he realized how right." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Mr. Ridge, what happens if we lose? If Dalton's political connections are too strong, or if the marshals don't believe our evidence?" "Then we make it too expensive for them to win," Ridge replied firmly. "We document everything. We make sure their crimes are exposed, even if they succeed temporarily, and we make sure the story gets told in newspapers from here to Washington. Sometimes the best you can do is make the cost of corruption higher than the profit." Before Margaret could respond, Frank Walsh appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Ridge, you need to see this. There are riders approaching, at least 6 of them, and they're not trying to be quiet about it." Ridge was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his rifle. "How far out?" "Maybe 10 minutes, Walsh replied. "But here's the strange part. They're carrying torches, riding in formation like they want to be seen." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "It's Dalton. He's making his move early." Ridge nodded grimly. "Sounds like it. Frank, get everyone awake and ready. Don't arm them unless I give the word, but make sure they're prepared to move if necessary." As Walsh hurried away to alert the others, Ridge turned to Margaret. "Miss Sullivan, whatever happens in the next few minutes, remember that we've got the moral and legal high ground. Don't let Dalton provoke you into doing anything that could be used against us later." Margaret straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through the past week. "Mr. Ridge, I've dealt with factory owners who thought they could intimidate their workers through threats and manipulation. Dalton may have more resources, but he's not the first powerful man who's underestimated what ordinary people can accomplish when they work together." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls. Through the church windows, they could see the flickering light of torches moving through the darkness toward Clearwater Falls. "Here we go," Ridge muttered, checking his weapons one final time. "Whatever they're planning, we'll be ready for them." Margaret moved to stand beside him, looking out at the approaching riders. A week ago, she'd been a passenger on a stagecoach, expecting to step into a quiet domestic life. Now she was preparing to face down armed men who had committed murder to steal her community's land. The transformation still amazed her, but it no longer frightened her. Whatever Robert Dalton and his associates were planning to do, they were about to discover that the survivors of Clearwater Falls were no longer helpless victims waiting to be rescued. They were a community prepared to fight for their home. Torches cast dancing shadows across the muddy streets of Clearwater Falls as Robert Dalton led his men into the heart of the settlement. Margaret counted 8 riders this time, all armed, their faces hard and determined in the flickering light. But instead of the confident businessman who had arrived that morning, Dalton now carried himself like a man whose patience had run out. "Margaret," stepped onto the church porch, flanked by Samuel Ridge and Nathan Cooper. Behind them, the survivors and newly arrived workers formed a silent line, their presence making it clear that Clearwater Falls was no longer a collection of helpless refugees. "Miss Sullivan," Dalton called out, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I thought we had an understanding about my company's generous offer, yet I'm told you've been spreading malicious rumors and bringing in outside agitators to interfere with legitimate business operations." "Mr. Dalton," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "the only understanding we have is that you gave us 48 hours to consider your offer. By my calculation, that deadline hasn't expired yet." Dalton's smile was cold. "Circumstances have changed, Miss Sullivan. New information has come to light about the safety hazards in this area. I'm afraid immediate evacuation is now necessary for your own protection." Ridge stepped forward slightly. "What kind of new information, Mr. Dalton? Because we've been doing some investigating of our own, and what we've found raises serious questions about your company's activities in this region." One of Dalton's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his holstered pistol. Margaret noticed the gesture and realized with crystal clarity that this confrontation could turn violent very quickly. "Mr. Ridge," Dalton said, his tone becoming more threatening, "I warned you this morning about involving yourself in matters that don't concern you. Some men never learn to recognize when they're outmatched." Before Ridge could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Robert Dalton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and sabotage, resulting in multiple deaths." Everyone turned toward the sound, and Margaret's heart leaped as she saw 3 riders emerging from the darkness beyond the torchlight. The lead rider wore the unmistakable badge of a territorial marshal, and his companions carried the authority of federal law enforcement. "Marshal Williams," Ridge said with obvious satisfaction, "you made better time than I expected." Dalton's confident facade cracked completely. "Marshal, I don't know what lies this tracker has been telling you, but my company operates with complete legal authority. Any accusations of wrongdoing are simply attempts to interfere with legitimate business development." Marshal Williams dismounted, his weathered face impassive. "Mr. Dalton, we have extensive documentation of your company's activities, including evidence of deliberate sabotage to the dam structures in this valley. You and your associates will need to come with us for questioning." "You have no jurisdiction here," one of Dalton's men snarled, his hand now openly resting on his gun grip. "This is territorial land, and we're operating under proper territorial authority." "Actually," said one of Marshal Williams' companions, stepping into the light, "this investigation falls under federal jurisdiction due to the interstate nature of the mining fraud and the involvement of territorial officials in the conspiracy." Margaret recognized him as Agent Harrison, a federal investigator she had heard Dr. Crawford mention. The presence of federal authority meant this case had implications far beyond Clearwater Falls. Dalton's men were now openly agitated, several of them with hands on their weapons. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and Margaret realized that what happened in the next few moments could determine whether justice was served or violence erupted. "Mr. Dalton," she said, stepping forward despite Ridge's warning gesture, "you have a choice here. You can surrender to legal authority and face trial for your crimes, or you can resist and add armed confrontation with federal agents to your charges." Dalton's face twisted with rage. "You sanctimonious little fool. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? This valley contains millions of dollars in mineral wealth, and you've destroyed months of careful planning with your meddling." "Your planning included murdering innocent families," Margaret replied, her own anger finally breaking through her careful control. "You destroyed entire communities for profit. You deserve whatever consequences you face." "Miss Sullivan," Marshal Williams said quietly, "please step back. Mr. Dalton, you and your men need to surrender your weapons immediately." For a moment, the tableau held like a photograph. Armed men on horseback facing federal agents, with the survivors of Clearwater Falls standing witness to a confrontation that would determine their future. Then one of Dalton's men made a fatal decision. "Nobody's taking me alive!" he shouted, drawing his pistol and spurring his horse toward the federal agents. What followed happened with the violent speed of a mountain avalanche. Ridge's rifle barked. Once dropping the charging rider from his saddle, Marshal Williams and Agent Harrison returned fire as several of Dalton's remaining men chose violence over surrender. Nathan Cooper shoved Margaret behind a wooden beam as bullets whistled through the air where she had been standing. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but those minutes transformed the quiet mountain settlement into a battlefield. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Dalton's men lay dead or wounded. 2 others had fled into the darkness, and Dalton himself sat on his horse with his hands raised, a long cut across his cheek from a flying splinter. "It's over, Dalton," Marshal Williams said, keeping his weapon trained on the development company owner. "Your hired guns can't help you now." As the federal agents secured their prisoner and tended to the wounded, Margaret found herself sitting on the church steps, her legs too shaky to support her weight. The reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in. Armed men had come to drive them from their homes, and people had died defending the right of a community to exist. Dr. Crawford knelt beside her, checking for injuries. "Margaret, are you hurt? That was incredibly brave, but incredibly dangerous." "I'm fine, Doctor," she managed, though her voice was barely steady. "Is everyone else all right?" "One of Cooper's men took a bullet in the shoulder, but it's not serious," Crawford reported. "Otherwise, we were remarkably fortunate." Samuel Ridge approached, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Miss Sullivan, it's finished. Dalton will face trial for conspiracy and murder, and with the evidence we've gathered, he'll likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison." Margaret nodded, but found herself thinking about the larger implications of what had transpired. "Mr. Ridge, what happens to the Colorado Mountain Development Company? Do they have other people who might continue their operations?" "Agent Harrison was telling me that this investigation has been expanding for months," Ridge replied. "Dalton's company was part of a larger network of fraudulent mining operations throughout the territory. Tonight's events will probably bring down the entire conspiracy." Marshal Williams joined them, having finished securing the scene. "Miss Sullivan, I want you to know that your community's resistance to this fraud has exposed crimes that stretch from here to Washington. The territorial governor is personally interested in ensuring that Clearwater Falls receives whatever assistance it needs to rebuild." "Marshal, we appreciate the support," Margaret said, finally finding her voice again. "But I think we've proven that this community can take care of itself when it has to." Nathan Cooper, his arm in a makeshift sling from helping move the wounded, overheard the conversation. "Miss Sullivan's right, Marshal. In 1 week she's taken a group of flood survivors and turned them into a functioning community. With the mining threat eliminated, Clearwater Falls is going to thrive." As the immediate aftermath of the gunfight was sorted out, Margaret found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in hours. The past week had transformed her in ways she was still trying to understand. She had come to Colorado Territory expecting to become a rancher's wife, but had instead become something far more complex, a leader who had fought corruption and won. Miss Sullivan, Agent Harrison, approached, holding a thick folder of documents. "I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Without your decision to stay and organize resistance to Dalton's plans, we might never have gathered enough evidence to expose the full scope of this conspiracy." Margaret accepted the folder, noting that it contained detailed reports on the Colorado Mountain Development Company's activities. "Agent Harrison, what assurance do we have that this won't happen again, that other communities won't face similar threats?" "Your success here has already made a difference," Harrison replied. The territorial legislature is preparing new laws to prevent the kind of fraud and sabotage that Dalton's company used. What happened in Clearwater Falls is going to protect other frontier communities. As the federal agents prepared to transport their prisoners, Samuel Ridge came to sit beside Margaret on the church steps. Miss Sullivan, I received word from downstream while all this was happening. Thomas Brennan is recovering faster than expected. The doctor thinks he'll be able to travel by the end of the week. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest that was entirely different from the adrenaline and anger of the confrontation. He's really going to be all right? More than all right, Ridge smiled. And when he gets here, he's going to find that his intended bride has accomplished something truly remarkable. You've not just saved a community, Margaret. You've created something new, something stronger than what was here before. Margaret looked around at the settlement that had become her home. The rebuilt church, the organized work crews, the people who had learned to depend on each other through crisis and triumph. Whatever challenges the future might bring, Clearwater Falls was ready to face them. Mr. Ridge, she said, when Thomas arrives, he's going to find a wife who's learned she's capable of things she never imagined. I think that's going to make for an interesting marriage. Ridge laughed, the first truly relaxed sound she had heard from him. Miss Sullivan, I think Thomas Brennan is about to discover he's gotten much more than he bargained for, and I suspect he's going to consider himself the luckiest man in Colorado Territory. As the last of the federal agents disappeared into the mountain darkness with their prisoners, Margaret Sullivan stood on the porch of the Clearwater Falls Church and looked up at the stars scattered across the clear night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight justice had been served and a community had proven its right to exist. The mail-order bride who had arrived to find devastation had indeed taken command until help returned. But in the process, she had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when everything goes wrong, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with determination, organization, and an unshakable belief in the value of home. 5 days after the confrontation with Dalton's men, Clearwater Falls buzzed with activity that would have been unimaginable just 2 weeks earlier. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the valley as reconstruction. Crews worked on multiple buildings simultaneously. The general store's frame was rising again. The school had a new roof, and the blacksmith shop was operational for the first time since the flood. Margaret stood in the doorway of the newly completed community hall, reviewing the inventory lists that had become as familiar to her as her own name. Supplies continued to arrive daily from Denver and other settlements, sent by territorial officials who wanted to ensure that Clearwater Falls' remarkable recovery became a symbol of frontier resilience rather than corporate exploitation. Miss Sullivan, called out Martha Pierce, who had taken over coordinating the textile and clothing needs for the expanding community. The ladies from Pine Ridge sent another wagon load of fabric and sewing supplies. They're asking if we need seamstresses, not to help with the increased population. Margaret looked up from her papers, amazed as always by how quickly their situation continued to evolve. What had begun as 13 survivors clinging to existence had grown to nearly 60 people, as families from other flood-damaged communities chose to relocate to Clearwater Falls rather than abandon the mountain region entirely. Tell them yes, Mrs. Pierce. With all the new families arriving, we'll need expanded services of every kind. Margaret paused, consulting her notes. Also, ask Dr. Crawford if he thinks we should start planning for a permanent medical clinic. It's becoming clear that we're going to be much larger than the original settlement. The growth brought its own challenges, but they were the kind of problems Margaret had learned to embrace rather than fear. Housing, food distribution, work coordination, education for children, medical care, all the complex requirements of a functioning community that she was discovering she had a talent for managing. A commotion near the main road caught her attention. Riders were approaching, but these weren't the threatening figures that had marked Dalton's visits. Instead, she recognized the steady pace of travelers rather than raiders, and her heart began to race as she realized who might be among them. "Miss Sullivan!" Jimmy Torres came running from his position near the rebuilt bridge. "It's them! Mr. Ridge is back, and he's got Mr. Brennan with him." Margaret felt her breath catch as she saw the small group of riders emerging from the tree line. Samuel Ridge led the way, but beside him rode a man she had never seen, yet somehow recognized immediately. Thomas Brennan sat his horse with the careful posture of someone still recovering from serious injury, but his eyes were alert and searching as they took in the transformed settlement. Behind them rode 6 other men, the husbands and fathers, who had gone downstream to help other communities and were finally returning home. Margaret could hear Sarah Coleman's cry of joy as she recognized her husband John among the group, and similar exclamations arose from other families as they spotted their returning loved ones. But Margaret's attention remained fixed on Thomas. Brennan as Ridge led him directly toward the community hall. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders and weathered hands that spoke of years working the land. His face bore the lingering pallor of recent illness, but his brown eyes, the eyes she remembered from his sister's description through Dr. Crawford, were warm and intelligent as they met hers. "Miss Margaret Sullivan," Ridge announced with obvious satisfaction, "I believe you've been expecting this gentleman." Thomas dismounted carefully, his movements showing the lingering effects of his head injury, and walked slowly toward Margaret. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The woman who had traveled across a continent to marry a stranger, and the man who had unknowingly left his intended bride to face the greatest challenge of her life. "Margaret," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the same gentleness she remembered from Ridge's descriptions. "Samuel has told me what you've accomplished here, what you've built." He gestured toward the bustling settlement around them. "I came back expecting to find the woman I'd been corresponding with for months. Instead, I find someone who's become a legend in her own right." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thomas, I simply did what needed to be done, what anyone would have done in the same circumstances." Thomas shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Margaret, most people would have taken the first stage back to Denver. You stayed and fought for a community you'd never seen, for people you'd never met, and for a man who might never have returned. That's not what anyone would do. That's what someone extraordinary does." Before Margaret could respond, Sarah Coleman appeared at her elbow, having been reunited with her own husband. "Miss Sullivan, Margaret, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but John wants to meet the woman who kept us all together while the men were away." John Coleman stepped forward, a stocky man with kind eyes and calloused hands. "Miss Sullivan, my wife has told me about your leadership during the crisis. On behalf of all the families, I want you to know that we are grateful beyond words. You didn't just keep our community alive, you made it stronger than it ever was before." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the praise, especially coming from the man whose leadership position she had essentially filled during his absence. "Mr. Coleman, I was just trying to keep things organized until you returned. Now that you're back—" "Now that I'm back," John interrupted gently, "I hope you'll consider staying on as our community coordinator. What you've built here requires someone with your skills and vision to keep it growing." Thomas stepped closer to Margaret, his expression serious but hopeful. "Margaret, if you're willing, I'd like to discuss not just our original plans for marriage, but the possibility of building something larger together, a real partnership in developing this community." Margaret looked around at the settlement that had become her home and her purpose. The rebuilt buildings, the organized work crews, the families reunited and newcomers welcomed, all of it representing something she had helped create from the ashes of disaster. "Thomas," she said carefully. "I need you to understand that I'm not the same woman who wrote those letters from Boston. The past 2 weeks have changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm not sure I can simply settle into the quiet, domestic life we originally planned." Thomas nodded seriously. "Margaret, I wouldn't want you to. The woman who organized the defense of Clearwater Falls, who exposed a criminal conspiracy, and who built a thriving community from a group of flood survivors. That woman deserves a partnership that matches her capabilities." Dr. Crawford approached, having finished examining several of the returning men for travel-related injuries. "Thomas, Margaret, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I have news from Denver that affects both of you and the entire community." Margaret turned toward the doctor with the alert attention she had developed for important announcements. "What kind of news, Dr. Crawford?" "The territorial governor has officially designated Clearwater Falls as a model community for frontier development," Crawford announced. "There's going to be territorial funding for a proper school, a medical clinic, improved roads, and even telegraph service. They want to use your success story to attract stable development throughout the mountain regions." Thomas looked amazed. "Territorial funding? For a settlement this size?" "It's not just about size," Crawford explained. "It's about what Margaret accomplished here. She proved that communities can resist corporate exploitation and build something sustainable when they're properly organized and led. The governor wants to replicate that success elsewhere." Nathan Cooper, who had been supervising construction work, joined the conversation. "Miss Sullivan, this also means we'll need to expand our planning significantly. If the territory is serious about making this a model community, we're talking about growth that could bring us to several hundred residents within a year or two." Margaret felt a familiar surge of excitement at the prospect of tackling such an ambitious project. "Mr. Cooper, do you think we can manage that kind of expansion without losing the community spirit we've developed?" "With the right leadership, absolutely," Cooper replied, "but it would require someone who understands both the practical aspects of development and the importance of maintaining the values that made this place special to begin with." Thomas was watching Margaret's face as she processed these possibilities, and she could see understanding dawning in his expression. "Margaret, you're not thinking about this as a challenge to avoid, are you? You're thinking about it as an opportunity to embrace." Margaret met his gaze directly. "Thomas, 2 weeks ago, I would have been terrified by the thought of helping plan a major community development. Today, I find myself wondering how quickly we can start designing the expansion and what resources we'll need to do it properly." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "Margaret Sullivan, I think I'm about to marry the most remarkable woman in Colorado territory. And I think our life together is going to be far more adventurous than either of us originally imagined." Before Margaret could respond, Samuel Ridge approached with an official-looking document in his hand. "Miss Sullivan, Thomas, I hate to interrupt, but I have something that needs to be addressed before any wedding planning begins." Margaret felt a moment of concern. "What is it, Mr. Ridge?" "It's a formal offer from the territorial government," Ridge explained. "They want to hire you as a community development consultant, Margaret. Your job would be to help other settlements that are facing challenges similar to what Clearwater Falls experienced." Thomas looked startled. "They want to hire Margaret specifically?" "Apparently, word of her success here has reached some very influential people," Ridge continued. "The territorial governor believes that Margaret's combination of organizational skills and community leadership could be applied to help struggling settlements throughout the region." Margaret stared at the document, her mind racing with the implications. "Mr. Ridge, are you saying they want me to travel to other communities and help them organize their development?" "Not exactly," Ridge replied. "They want you to establish a training center here in Clearwater Falls, Other community leaders would come here to learn the methods you developed, and you would occasionally visit communities that are facing specific crises. Thomas was watching Margaret's face intently. "Margaret, what are you thinking?" Margaret looked around at the bustling settlement, at the people who had trusted her leadership during their darkest hours, and at the man who had traveled across mountains to find her. The magnitude of what was being offered was almost overwhelming, but she realized that the decision itself was surprisingly clear. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I came to Colorado Territory to start a new life. And that's exactly what I've done. But it's not the life I expected. It's something much more challenging and much more rewarding." She turned to Thomas, her expression serious but hopeful. "Thomas, if we're going to build a marriage and a partnership, I need you to understand that I can't go back to being the quiet school teacher who answered your advertisement. That woman doesn't exist anymore." Thomas stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Margaret, I don't want you to go back to being anyone other than who you are right now. The woman who organized the salvation of Clearwater Falls, who exposed corruption and fought for justice. That's the woman I want to marry. Even if it means our life will be filled with challenges and responsibilities we never anticipated," Margaret asked. "Especially if it means that," Thomas replied firmly. "Margaret, I wrote to you originally because I was looking for a partner, strong enough to build a life on the frontier. I just didn't realize how strong you actually were." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "In that case, Mr. Brennan, I accept your proposal of marriage, and I accept the territorial government's offer. And I accept the challenge of building something extraordinary together." The crowd of community members who had gathered to witness this reunion erupted in cheers and applause. Sarah Coleman was crying openly, while her husband John was already talking with Nathan Cooper about expansion plans for the settlement. Dr. Crawford was making notes about medical facilities for a training center, and Jimmy Torres was practically bouncing with excitement at the prospect of continued growth and development. As the celebration continued around them, Thomas and Margaret found themselves in a moment of relative quiet, standing together while their community buzzed with activity and planning. "Margaret," Thomas said softly, "when I first wrote that advertisement seeking a mail-order bride, I thought I was looking for someone to share a simple ranch life. I never imagined I would find someone who would transform not just my life, but an entire region." Margaret smiled, feeling completely at peace for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach 2 weeks earlier. "Thomas, when I answered your advertisement, I thought I was seeking security and a quiet domestic life. I never imagined I would discover that I was capable of leadership, of fighting for justice, and of building something that could make a difference for dozens of families." "So, what do we do now?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the thriving community around them. Margaret looked out over Clearwater Falls, the rebuilt structures, the organized work crews, the families reunited and the newcomers welcomed, the children playing safely in streets that had been underwater just 2 weeks ago. She thought about the territorial offer, the responsibility of helping other communities, the challenge of managing continued growth and development. "Now," she said, taking Thomas's hand and feeling the strength and steadiness that had drawn her to his letters in the first place, "we build something extraordinary. We create a marriage based on partnership and mutual respect. We develop a community that serves as a model for frontier democracy and cooperation. And we prove that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that take us to places we never expected to go." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Margaret Sullivan, soon to be Brennan, I think we're about to embark on the greatest adventure of our lives." As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting Clearwater Falls in shades of gold and amber, Margaret Sullivan stood with her intended husband and looked out over the community she had helped save and transform. The mail-order bride who had arrived to find devastation had indeed taken command until help returned. But in the process, she had discovered something far more valuable than the security she had originally sought. She had found her calling, her home, and her true self in the Colorado mountains. And tomorrow, with Thomas by her side and a community full of people who believed in their shared vision, she would begin building something that would endure long after the floodwaters were forgotten and the threat of corporate exploitation was just a memory. The greatest adventures, Margaret had learned, began not with careful planning, but with the courage to stay and fight when everything went wrong. And the greatest love stories were written not in quiet moments of domestic tranquility, but in the partnership of two people working together to build something larger than themselves. In Clearwater Falls, Colorado Territory, in the year 1882, both adventures and love stories were just beginning. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the newly constructed Clearwater Falls Community Center, illuminating the detailed maps and planning documents spread across the large oak table that had become the heart of Margaret's operations. She stood reviewing the latest correspondence from territorial officials, her wedding ring catching the light as she made notes in the margins of a development proposal. "Mrs. Brennan," called out Elizabeth Harper, the young woman who had recently arrived from St. Louis to serve as Margaret's assistant in the Community Development Program. "The delegation from Silver Creek has arrived early. They're very eager to begin the training session." Margaret looked up from her papers, still adjusting to her married name after the simple but joyful ceremony that had taken place 6 weeks earlier. The wedding had been a community celebration, with families from 5 different settlements attending, to witness the union of the woman who had become a symbol of frontier determination and the man whose recovery had represented hope for all the flood survivors. "Excellent, Elizabeth. Please show them to the conference room and offer them coffee. I'll join them in just a moment." Margaret gathered the relevant training materials she had developed over the past months: systematic approaches to crisis management, resource allocation, community organization, and sustainable development that had emerged from her experience in Clearwater Falls. The success of their model community had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as an emergency response to disaster had evolved into a comprehensive system for frontier community development that was being studied and replicated throughout the territory. Margaret found herself corresponding with community leaders from Montana to New Mexico, sharing strategies and troubleshooting challenges that ranged from water management to conflict resolution. Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had just finished a productive morning's work. Marriage had agreed with both of them, though it bore little resemblance to the quiet domestic arrangement they had originally envisioned. "How are the Silver Creek representatives?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Margaret's desk that had become his unofficial spot during her morning planning sessions. "Determined but overwhelmed," Margaret replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Their situation is complicated. They have the flooding damage, but they also have territorial disputes with 3 different mining companies and a corrupt local sheriff who's been taking bribes to look the other way." Thomas whistled softly. "That's a more complex challenge than what we faced here." "Yes, but they have advantages we didn't have initially," Margaret pointed out. "They have 26 families committed to staying and rebuilding. They have documented evidence of the corruption, and most importantly, they have the benefit of learning from our experience rather than having to invent solutions during a crisis." The development of systematic training programs had become Margaret's particular passion. She had discovered that many of the skills she had learned in textile manufacturing, workflow organization, resource management, quality control, personnel coordination, translated remarkably well to community development when combined with the leadership abilities she had discovered during the flood crisis. Speaking of learning from experience, Thomas said, pulling out a letter bearing the territorial seal, "This arrived this morning from the governor's office. They want to discuss expanding the program significantly." Margaret opened the letter, her eyebrows rising as she read. "They want to establish 5 regional training centers across the territory, with Clearwater Falls as the headquarters. They're offering federal funding and legislative support." "That would mean traveling extensively," Thomas observed. "Months away from home, working with communities across hundreds of miles of territory." Margaret looked at her husband, searching, his expression for signs of concern or reluctance. "Thomas, how do you feel about that possibility? It would dramatically change our life together." Thomas smiled, reaching across to take her hand. "Margaret, 6 months ago I was a man with a modest ranch and dreams of a quiet family life. Today, I'm married to the most influential community development expert in Colorado Territory. I'm managing agricultural operations for a settlement of nearly 100 people, and I'm helping coordinate regional food distribution networks. Change has been good to us." Before Margaret could respond, Samuel Ridge appeared in the doorway, his travel-stained clothing indicating he had just returned from one of his frequent scouting expeditions. "Mrs. Brennan, Thomas," he greeted them with a nod. "I bring news from the eastern settlements. The situation in Pine Valley has taken a turn for the worse." Margaret immediately focused on Ridge's report. Pine Valley was one of the communities she had been corresponding with about potential development assistance, and she had been concerned about reports of corporate pressure similar to what they had faced from Dalton's company. "What kind of turn, Mr. Ridge?" "Armed intimidation has escalated to property destruction," Ridge replied grimly. 3 family homes burned last week, and the local sheriff claims it was accidental fires. The territorial marshal is investigating, but the community leadership is asking for immediate assistance. Margaret felt the familiar surge of determination that had carried her through the crisis in Clearwater Falls. "How many families are we talking about?" 43 families, including 18 children under the age of 12, Ridge answered. "They have good land, adequate water, and strong community bonds. What they lack is experience dealing with the kind of systematic pressure they're facing." Thomas was already reaching for the territorial maps they kept in the desk drawer. "Pine Valley is about 60 miles northeast of here. Difficult terrain, but accessible if we take the mountain route through Bear Creek Pass." Margaret was mentally calculating logistics, personnel, supplies, travel time, and the resources they could mobilize quickly. "Mr. Ridge, what's the timeline? How long do we have before the situation becomes critical?" "Based on the pattern I've seen in other corporate land grabs, maybe 2 weeks before they escalate to direct violence against community leaders," Ridge replied. "After that, families will start leaving rather than risk their children's safety." Margaret stood up, her decision already made. "Elizabeth, please reschedule the Silver Creek training session for next week. Send word to Dr. Crawford, Nathan, Cooper, and Ben Fitzgerald that we have an emergency consultation. Thomas, can you coordinate with the Territorial Marshal's office to ensure we have legal authority for intervention?" Thomas was already reaching for his coat. "Consider it done. Margaret, are you thinking of direct intervention or consultation support?" "Direct intervention," Margaret replied without hesitation. "If Pine Valley falls to corporate intimidation, it sends a message to every other community that resistance is futile. We can't allow that precedent to be established." Ridge nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Brennan, you'll need more than consultation to handle this situation. The companies involved have hired professionals, men who specialize in driving communities off valuable land through systematic terror." "Then we'll need professionals of our own," Margaret said, her mind already working through the personnel and resources they could mobilize. Mr. Ridge, can you coordinate with the territorial marshals to provide legal enforcement support? Thomas, I'll need you to organize a relief convoy with supplies for 43 families. Dr. Crawford will need to prepare for potential medical emergencies. As the three of them began detailed planning for what would essentially be a military-style operation to save an endangered community, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had evolved since answering Thomas's original advertisement. For a mail-order bride, the quiet Boston schoolteacher who had dreamed of domestic tranquility had become a regional leader coordinating complex operations across hundreds of miles of frontier territory. The woman who had once worried about managing a classroom of 30 students was now responsible for the welfare of multiple communities and hundreds of families. "Margaret," Thomas said, interrupting her thoughts, "there's something else we should discuss. If we're successful in Pine Valley, and if the territorial government approves the expanded training program, we're talking about a level of responsibility that could define the development of this entire region for decades." Margaret understood the implications he was raising. Success would bring increased visibility, greater responsibilities, and inevitably more powerful enemies. The comfortable life they had begun to build in Clearwater Falls would be permanently transformed by the demands of regional leadership. "Thomas, are you concerned about the risks?" "I'm concerned about whether we're prepared for the scope of what we might be taking on," Thomas replied honestly. "But I'm not concerned about whether we should do it. Margaret, what you've accomplished here has proven that organized communities can resist corporate exploitation and build sustainable prosperity. That knowledge needs to be shared as widely as possible." Ridge was studying the maps of Pine Valley, marking strategic locations and potential problems. "Mrs. Brennan, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Half measures against professional intimidation tactics will only make the situation worse." Margaret felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders, but it was a familiar weight now, the responsibility of leadership that she had discovered she not only could bear, but actually thrived under. "Gentlemen, send word to Pine Valley that Clearwater Falls is organizing immediate assistance. Tell them that help is coming and that they don't have to face this threat alone." As Ridge left to begin coordinating with territorial authorities, and Thomas departed to organize the relief convoy, Margaret found herself alone in the community center that had become the nerve center of a growing movement for frontier justice and community self-determination. Through the window, she could see the bustling streets of Clearwater Falls, children playing safely, businesses thriving, families working together on community projects that would have been impossible just 6 months earlier. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that frontier communities could build something stronger than corporate exploitation, something more lasting than individual profit. The mail-order bride, who had arrived to find devastation, had not only taken command until help returned, she had discovered a calling that would shape the development of the American West for generations to come. And tomorrow, she would carry that calling to Pine Valley, where 43 families waited for someone brave enough to stand with them against forces that seemed impossible to resist. Margaret Brennan smiled as she began drafting the operational plans that would determine whether justice or corporate greed would prevail in the Colorado mountains. Some adventures, she had learned, never really end. They just evolve into larger adventures with higher stakes and greater opportunities to make a difference. In Pine Valley, the greatest test of everything she had learned was waiting. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.